Welcome to TaNaCh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Torah Talk Weekly Parsha with Rabbi Rafi Mollot, coming to you live from Houston, the Big H, Houston, Texas. And you get to experience this one with no music and nothing, just but a raw video, because this is the other computer. I've been working all day to try to get this thing running and got it ready just in the nick of time to go live. So, Rabbi, welcome back. It's always a pleasure having you here. I enjoyed visiting with you earlier today on the phone as well. I like getting those little extra phone calls from time to time. Kind of makes me feel that much more special. So, very good. Welcome back. Welcome back. Parshat Vayigash.
Thank you for having me, William.
Yes, sir.
Parshas Vayigash. Okay, so this is the third of kind of a trilogy of beautiful parshios revolving around the figure of Yosef, and we were able to talk a little bit about Parshas Vayeshev, and then we missed last week Parshas Miketz, and now Vayigash. But to understand the context of Vayigash, we really need to run through the story up until now. So we talked about how the 12 brothers had a conflict, between Joseph, one of the brothers, and his fellow brothers, that ended up in them selling him down to Egypt. And at the end, he meets these two prisoners in the prison. First he becomes a slave, and then he's accused of doing something inappropriate with the wife of Potiphar. He's sent to prison. In prison, summing up as quick as I can, in prison he meets these two prisoners. Each was a royal officer of the Pharaoh, one who was in charge of drink and one who was in charge of bread, and each one found themselves in prison for whatever infraction is not explicit in the text, and we're not going to go now into what that might have been. But in any event, they each have a dream. Joseph interprets the dream. He tells the what sometimes is translated as the butler, it's the butler and the baker. Sometimes they translate it as the toastmaster. I love that translation, the Sar HaMashkim, which really means officer of drinks, is called the toastmaster in some translations, which I love. That is so cool, the toastmaster. He tells the toastmaster that Pharaoh is going to reinstate him, and he tells the baker that Pharaoh is going to execute him, and lo and behold, this comes to be. Then the following parsha, which is Miketz means at the end of, because it begins with at the end of 2 years. At the end of 2 years, Pharaoh has these two dreams about the 7 fat cows and the 7 skinny cows, and the skinny cows swallow the fat cows, and they're as skinny as ever, and the 7 fat sheaves and the 7 skinny sheaves, and the skinny sheaves swallow the fat sheaves, and Pharaoh needs an interpreter for his dream. And so the toastmaster pipes up and says, I remember a Hebrew man in the prison who interpreted my dream. So Pharaoh has him come and interpret the dream, and he says there's going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine, and you need to appoint someone who is going to manage the food during the years of plenty so that you'll be able to store food for the years of famine. And Pharaoh says, you're so wise, I appoint you, and he becomes royalty. And he manages the finances in Egypt during the years of plenty. And when the famine hits and all the land is hungry, and Jacob sends his sons down to Egypt to get grain, and they come before Joseph, and Joseph recognizes them, and they don't recognize him, and he doesn't reveal himself to them. Rather, he goes through this ruse. And the big question for last week, which we could have talked about if we had a class, was why was Joseph putting on a ruse? Why didn't he just come out and say, brothers, it's me, Joseph, which he will do in this Parsha, but that's not our topic. Our topic is this week's Parsha. So for reasons that are, Joseph puts on a ruse. He pretends to be mean to them, and he accuses them of being spies. He tells them, he takes Shimon prisoner, and he tells them, bring me the brother who didn't come. Benjamin wasn't sent because Jacob was fearful that something would occur to Benjamin like happened to Joseph. And he had only 2 children from his wife Rachel that he loved. And Joseph is gone, and he had to protect he had to protect Benjamin. It's like Saving Private Ryan. When there's only one brother left, you have to get him home, or something could happen to him. So this was Saving Private Benjamin. And Joseph tells his brothers, if you don't bring me your brother Benjamin, then I will know that you are lying to me and you're spies. And I'll keep your brother Shimon here as collateral. So bring me Benjamin so I know you're telling the truth. And they go back, and long story short, Jacob doesn't want them to bring Benjamin. And so Judah basically gives Yaakov a guarantee. He says, which becomes relevant in our Parsha. He says, I'll bring the boy back to you, or he says, V'chatasi lecha kol hayamim, this is in last week's Parsha, I will have sinned to you all of the days, which we understand means he was forfeiting his share in the world to come. He said, I'm forfeiting my share in the world to come if I don't bring the Benjamin back to you. So he put his eternity on the table. He says, I guarantee you I bring him back. And so, Jacob says, what can I do? You forced my hand, go. And he takes Benjamin, and then Joseph lulls them into this false sense of security, and he puts the silver goblet into Benjamin's bag secretly. And then as they're leaving Egypt, after what seemed like a very friendly meeting, and they got Shimon back and everything, Simon, they're going back, and Joseph's officer stops them and he says, thieves, you stole from the king. They said, what do you mean? We didn't steal. The one who stole should be put to death, etc. And they go and they find in the bag of Benjamin the silver goblet. And now they're saying, we're taking Benjamin slave. You all can leave. And they say, no, if you take one of us, you take all of us. And they all return in front of Joseph. And that's where we find ourselves beginning the Parsha. So stop me at any time for questions, as I usually say. So what happens is the Parsha's Vayigash begins with the words Vayigash love Yehuda. Yehuda approached Joseph. That's what Vayigash means, and he approached. And what's interesting here is you see of all the sons, there's a setup going on, and this all goes back to what I told you in Parshas Vayetze. And if you didn't watch that class, watch that class about the dual roles of Judah and Joseph. We did a whole class on it, but you see that Parshas Vayeshev is setting this up, that you have the story of Joseph developing on the one hand and the story of Judah developing on the other hand, these parallel stories. We're not going to go back to Parshas Vayeshev, and I didn't have time that week to talk about it. But if you read it, you'll see, it's sort of like, meanwhile in Canaan, Judah, goes down from his brothers, and the whole story happens with Tamar and the children that he has with her, etc. And then meanwhile in Egypt, Joseph is going through this, and then in the story where they come together, so who's the one that stands up and takes responsibility and says, I will return Benjamin to you? It's Judah of all the sons. He takes leadership. So you see the ascendance of Judah, and here Judah made this guarantee to Jacob. So now he comes and confronts Joseph that he doesn't know is Joseph, but this Egyptian ruler who is attempting to take their brother away. And of all the brothers, Vayigash love Yehuda, Judah approaches Joseph and he stands up to him. And it's this incredible clash of titans. It's the power of Joseph on the one hand, and it's the power of Judah on the other. These two equal and opposite forces coming into full clash with one another. And that's really what saves the day is you needed the equal and opposite forces in order to bring this conflict to its resolution. And he comes before him and he says, he says what he says. He makes his petition that he should release him, and he says, he tells him the whole story, it's like a repetition, the whole thing. We're 10 brothers and we lost one of our brothers, and he meant so much to our father, and this was the only son left for him, to our father from Rachel, the mother of this other brother that was lost, and we never would want to see the pain that our father went through. We wouldn't want to see it again occur to him. Our father could die from heartache, right? And and this essentially, I guess I'll go back and say, this was why Joseph did what he did. The reason Joseph didn't reveal himself to his brothers is because all he had in his mind essentially was a snapshot of the last moment he had with his brothers when they were disposing of him and saying, "You're not one of us. You're not wanted. We're getting rid of you." They wanted to kill him. And so because, again, he was the brother on the one hand from Rachel, and they were the brothers from Leah, and they saw these two forces as being in conflict, like Jacob and Esau. And all that, you have to go back to Vayetze and Vayeshev to understand, to those classes. But he said, are they going to, in other words, he didn't see Benjamin with them. They came without Benjamin, and he said, maybe they disposed of my brother the way they disposed of me. The sons of Rachel, they wanted to get rid of the sons of Rachel because they felt that we were the Esau's of the family. They got rid of me, and they got rid of my brother. So he wasn't going to reveal himself to them. He wanted to find out what happened to Benjamin. So he put them in a situation where they had to be honest because they didn't know he was Joseph. There was no reason to conceal. And so he got the confession from them, at least their story, that Benjamin was alive and with their father. He says, I want to see him. Bring him down to me. He had to force this confrontation. Now, when Benjamin finally was brought to him, he wanted to recreate the exact situation that happened with him to see where his brothers changed men. Could he reveal himself to them safely and feel that they would accept him in the family? Or were they still antagonistic to the sons of Rachel? So he framed Benjamin as the thief. He said, how will you treat my brother if you think he's a villain? Will you do to him what you did to me? And so he puts the chalice, the goblet in Benjamin's bag, and he waits to see what are they going to do. And he says, you guys can go free. we're just going to take this one as a slave. Just like happened to Joseph, he was sold as a slave by his brothers. Would they be satisfied with that and say, okay, no skin off our back. The sons of Rachel, they're no good. This no good thief over here, just like his brother, just like his uncle. And they could come back to Jacob with a clear conscience and say, do you know what Benjamin did? Your no good son, he stole. He gets what's coming to him. Joseph was waiting to see. And the brothers put everything on the line for him. They said, no. If it's one of us, it's all of us. And they came in front of Joseph as a unified force. And his brother Judah, who sold him, says, we're not leaving without Benjamin. And they tell the whole story because of the pain of our father, etc. So here Joseph sees, my brothers are changed men. My brothers are not the same as when they did that to me. They are showing that they regret and they repent, and they are making good on the bad deed that they performed. So here is when he reveals himself, when they show that the circumstance of the sale of Joseph was in the past and regretted and repented for. So it's in verse chapter 45, verse 3, right? So in chapter 45, it says Joseph could no longer, in verse 1, he says Joseph could no longer, withhold himself. And so he says to the Egyptians, go out, what's going to take place here now between me and these men is private. And of course he wanted to not shame them publicly when he would reveal himself, and their shame would be revealed of what they did. He didn't want to embarrass them in front of others. So he told the Egyptians, go out. And they went out. It's very emotional. He cries, and he says to his brothers, he says in verse 3, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? And the verse says, and they could not answer him because they feared before him. What does the English say? They were so dumbfounded on account of him. The Hebrew word behala, it's a type of confusion, fear, confoundment. And so there's a puzzle in this verse, because he says, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? So what's with the juxtaposition of these two things? And also, why is he asking, is my father still alive? They told him about 20 times between all the different visits, we have an elderly father and we don't want him to die and we can't bring the young son. And doesn't he know the father is alive? What is he asking? Is my father still alive? They told him already that he's still alive. What is he asking? And it says they couldn't answer him because they were all confounded. And, well, why couldn't they answer him? What was stopping them from answering him? So the rabbis in the Medrash, this is a Medrash in Bereshis Rabbah, chapter 93, paragraph 10. And the rabbis analyze this confrontation between the brothers and this give and take, where Joseph says, I am Joseph, is my father still alive? And they were unable to answer him out of fear of him. So they say these words, Oy lanu miyom hadin, woe to us from the day of judgment. Oy lanu miyom hatochecha, woe to us from the day of rebuke. Meaning, Joseph opens his mouth and rebukes his brothers, and they were so shocked by his rebuke that they couldn't answer, and they were so fearful from the rebuke that they were unable to open their mouth and answer. They said, if that's just from their brother Joseph, was such an emotional reaction from them. Said, imagine the day of judgment. Imagine the day of rebuke, when we stand in front of our Creator and he's going to rebuke us for the wrongdoings that we are responsible for in our life, and say, why did you do that? What's with this? You remember that? And we're going to stand there dumbfounded and fearful, like, I can't believe I did that thing, and I'm confronting God about it, and how do I, he's asking of me what I've done, and I'm not able to answer. So this is the rabbi's analysis of this interaction of the rebuke of Joseph to his brothers, and their inability to answer is like a foreshadowing of our own confrontation with God on the day of judgment. However, if what I said now confused you, it confused you for good reason, because the commentaries ask, what rebuke are they referring to? In what way did Joseph rebuke them? In other words, this confrontation between Joseph and the brothers, I am Joseph, is my father still alive? And they go, woe unto us from the day of judgment, woe unto us for the day of rebuke. Where's the rebuke? What rebuke are you referring to when you compare this revelation of Joseph to his brothers as the rebuke of God to us on the day of judgment, on the day of rebuke? So, and together with that, the question asked, again, how is this a rebuke? I am Joseph, and is my father still alive? Why is he asking, is his father still alive? Why is he juxtaposing these two? I am Joseph, is my father still alive? So there is a very classic resolution to this problem that's presented in a work called Beis Halevi by Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, the original Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, as opposed to there's a more contemporary Yosef Dov Soloveitchik known as Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, or JB, Yashiv Ber, sometimes he's called, which is the famous Rabbi Soloveitchik who was the head of Yeshiva University, the learning component, the yeshiva component of Yeshiva University in more modern times. So his great-grandfather was, that he's named for, Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, was known as the Beis Halevi. He was an Eastern European Lithuanian rabbi, and he wrote many classic works of Jewish study. One is the Beis Halevi, where he asked this question: what exactly was the rebuke of Joseph in this interaction that our rabbis are identifying? And so he says, this is the rebuke. The rebuke is, I am Joseph. I'm the one that you sold. You're telling me that I can't keep Benjamin because you're so concerned about your father. You're so concerned about the pain he's going to go through. You're so concerned about the damage it could do to him, the death that it could cause him to lose his beloved son Benjamin, the son of Rachel. Do you know who I am? I am the son of Rachel. I am Yosef. And let me ask you, is my father still alive? Did he die when you did what you did to me? I can hear you. Okay, you want me to just go ahead and continue? Well, man, now I can't hear you. I'm going to go ahead and continue because he told me to go ahead and continue. So he says, you're going to tell me that you're so concerned about your father because he loves his son Benjamin, because Benjamin's the son of Rachel. And if I take him away, your father's going to die. He says, well, I'm Joseph. I am the son of Rachel. Is my father still alive? You sold me. You took me away from him. Did he die? Where was your concern for your father, our father? Where was your concern for him when you did to me what you did to me? So in other words, they're explaining their actions with a certain explanation. We can't let Benjamin go because of this result. He says, really? Is that really what's going on? In other words, this was another test of Joseph to see if they were sincere. Maybe, is that the real reason you're doing what you're doing now? Because you really care about our father? Is that the reason? Or is there something else? In other words, Judah put on the line his own eternity here. Maybe the only reason that he's acting the way he's acting in defense of Benjamin is selfishly. I put my eternity on the line. I bargained my portion in the world to come if I wouldn't bring back Benjamin. So it's my head on the platter over here. So what is your true motive? Is it yourself? You're worried about what's going to happen to you, or you're worried about what's going to happen to my father? And the proof is, you weren't worried about what was going to happen to my father when you did it to me. So I don't accept the reasoning you're giving now, because it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And so our rabbis say, this is the rebuke, and this is what we're going to come face to face with when we shuffle off this mortal coil and we're given a sort of review of our life. And we're going to have to make excuses for some of the things we did wrong. And we're going to come up with all these righteous motivations and say, well, it's because it was too difficult. It was too hard. I had this going against me. I had that going against me. And then God's going to turn around and show you a counterexample where you weren't bothered by those setbacks to do something you wanted to do. When you wanted to do a thing, it wasn't too difficult. But when you needed to do the right thing that I wanted to do, suddenly all these things are obstacles that weren't obstacles for you when it came to serving yourself. And we're not going to have an answer. So the brothers couldn't answer. Any excuse you can give, God's going to give you a counterexample to show it's not a good excuse. Because where there's a will, there's a way. When you wanted to do it, you found a way to do it. But when it came to doing the right thing, now you're coming up with excuses. So the excuses fall flat. It's not the true reason. Take responsibility for your wrongdoings. And just as Joseph showed himself as the counterexample to say, what are you going to say now? What's your excuse now for what you did wrong? And in the same way, we're going to be faced when we try to excuse away all our wrongdoings with all our righteous intentions and excuses. God's going to show us a counterexample that we're not going to have an answer for. And to say, you know what, you're right, I messed up. And that's really what true repentance is about stop making the excuses. Say, it's time for me to take responsibility for my actions. They had no answer for him. And woe unto us from the day of judgment and the day of rebuke. We're not going to have an answer. So it's time for us to stop making excuses and to start taking responsibility and changing. So I wanted to share an anecdote from the Talmud, and I'm sorry that I forgot to look up the citation, but the Talmud says that when a person moves into the next world. Now, I'll say this is specific to Jewish people who have an obligation of Torah study, not to say that Noahides don't. In other words, in order for a Noahide to be righteous, he has to know what his obligations are. And in order to know that, he has to study those portions of the Torah that would inform him. So obviously there's a sort of implicit obligation to study Torah. And there's a statement in the Talmud that a non-Jew who studies Torah is compared to the high priest in his level of holiness. And though there's a counter statement that says that a non-Jew who studies Torah is culpable perhaps to capital punishment, the Talmud resolves that by saying when it comes to matters that are relevant for the 7 laws of Noah, those are the areas where a non-Jew can and should study, and it's praiseworthy to do so. So even though this statement of the Talmud regarding Torah study is directed mainly towards Jews, it certainly has applications to a non-Jew. And again, even if you don't want to use the example of Torah study, you want to apply it to any commandment or responsibility that any human being has, we could apply it. But here the example says, if a person's going to come to the next world and God's going to say, did you study Torah in an appropriate amount for yourself? And if a person's going to say, it was too difficult for me because I was too poor and I was too busy pursuing a livelihood and trying to scrape together a few pennies to put food on the table, I didn't have time to study Torah. So the God's going to answer with a counterexample, and the counterexample is going to be, were you as poor as Hillel? Were you as poor as the sage Hillel? Now Hillel, who was one of the great sages of the Mishnah, our tradition tells us about him that he was extremely poverty-stricken, and he used to chop wood, and he would sell enough wood to earn a small coin, and with the small coin he would use half of that amount to buy the food he needed for that day, and which was obviously very meager, and half to pay there was a guard at that time. It was later eliminated, but at that time there was a guard stationed at the door of the study hall, and in order to enter the study hall to learn from the rabbis, you had to pay a fee. And this would later be eliminated, but it's another story. So at that time he had to pay. So every day he would go and he would struggle and work and toil to make a little bit of money, minimum wage. He would use half of it for his food and half of it to go into the study hall, and he would go and study. It says one day he either wasn't able to find wood, chop wood, sell wood. He wasn't able to earn his coin one day. So he's like, what am I going to do? So he was so desperate to study Torah that he went up onto the roof of the study hall, and he was listening in through the skylight on the roof. And there was a snowstorm. And he got buried underneath snow on the roof of the building. And the students in the building felt inside that it was darker than usual. And they were like, what's obscuring the skylight? And they looked up and they see this man pressed against the glass, frozen. And they're like, oh, it was Shabbos. Well, since it was Shabbos, there wouldn't have been a coin. So I'm not sure how that detail works. Maybe I'm messing up the details a little bit, but I do seem to recall. Maybe they only noticed that the next day was Shabbos. He had gotten frozen there. But there is a passage there that says that even though it was Shabbos, they decided to break Shabbos to save his life because he was freezing. So it may have been that he went on Friday and he froze till Saturday. And that would resolve the two details of the working and earning the coin, which he didn't earn, and then he couldn't get in. He had to go on the roof. He got frozen, and then on the Sabbath they found him and they thawed him out. They had to boil water and whatever, which is forbidden on the Sabbath. But they revive him, and they see this person's commitment to Torah study, that basically he becomes like, you get a free pass. And he became welcome in the study hall, and he rose to such heights in Torah that eventually he became the head of the Sanhedrin. Hillel became the head of the Sanhedrin. This is a person that was so poor, he didn't have a coin to his name, and it didn't stop him from pursuing Torah to the point of risking his life. So if a person's going to come before God and say, I didn't have the ability to study because I wasn't financially well off enough, God is going to say, it's not an excuse, because Hillel. And if the person would come and say, I was too wealthy and I had too many assets and too many businesses and too many business deals and too many properties and too many phone calls and too many meetings with lawyers, and I was busy all day and night managing all my financial assets and trading and whatever it is, morning till night, I didn't have time to study. They're going to say, were you more wealthy than Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus? Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was another one of the great sages of the period of the Mishnah. So to give a perspective, Hillel had a student named Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's student was Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, a couple generations later. And Rabbi Eliezer's student was the famous Rabbi Akiva. If you ever heard of Rabbi Akiva, just to put in historical perspective where these people line up. And all this is in about, around the 1st century going on. So, prior to the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai presided over the Sanhedrin when the destruction took place, and his students, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, taught even after that period. So it was all around the 1st century time. In any event, so Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was extremely, extremely wealthy, and it's worthwhile, I don't know how much time we have, it's worthwhile to talk about his personal story. But maybe I'll go to the end first and then we'll flash back. So he was so wealthy, he owned so many lands, and yet it never stopped him from studying Torah. Now, I'm sure what he did was he hired people to manage his properties so that he was free to study Torah. He owned a lot of property. He hired people to manage for him, and he would study Torah. And he was more or less oblivious of his finances. I remember there's a story, and I didn't look it up, and I'm not remembering it perfectly. But one day he's traveling, and he's kind of thinking and learning and speaking and learning to himself, and he loses his way, and he wanders onto some random land, and he finds a place to stay, and he goes, how much does it pay? How much does it cost to rent here? And they're like, rent here? You're Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. You own this place. And he's like, I do? He didn't even know the extent of his property. He didn't know where he owned property, that when he wandered his way onto one of his properties, he didn't even know it. He was so ensconced in his scholarship, even though he was exceedingly wealthy, one of the wealthiest people in Jewish history, which is why he's used as the counterexample. So the point is that woe to us to the day of judgment, woe to us to the day of rebuke. No matter what excuse we come up with, I was too poor. Well, were you poorer than Hillel? I was too rich. Were you richer than Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus? Ultimately, these are all excuses, but where there's a will, there's a way, and we're going to be to a certain degree held to task for the things where we fell short. So we should get into gear now. So on that note, let me tell you the story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, because a very uplifting story of a person with a humble beginning who rose to very great heights. I mean, I told you about Hillel already, who went from being a schnook to being the head of the Sanhedrin through his dedication, and he was dirt poor. You had Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, that we find this story in 2 sources. One, I believe, is Avos the Rabbi Nassan, and one is in a medrash called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which is a medrash that is his teachings, but the first 2 chapters is a biography of him. And one source gives his age as 22 years when the story begins. One source gives his age as 28 years when the story begins. But be that as it may, he was a man in his 20s. His father, Hyrcanus, and you can hear from the name Hyrcanus, which is a Greek name, or I don't know if it's Greek, Latin, whatever. I think it's Greek. It's a Greek name that he came from an assimilated family. And his father, who was a Jew, had a Greek name. And his father was not a scholar, but he was very, very wealthy. And he had employed his sons, Eliezer and his brothers, as managers of his multiple lands. So it says one day Eliezer was out in the field doing his work, and he was crying. And his father sees him crying, and he says, "Why are you crying?" And he doesn't want to tell him why. And so his father says, "I think I know the problem. This work is too easy for you. Let me give you a land that's covered in rocks. Instead of just plowing this kind of easy field over here, you'll have to clear this field of all the rocks before you can plow. It'll give you some harder work, and you'll feel a little more fulfilled, and you won't feel so depressed." So he puts Eliezer on the field, and Eliezer's crying, and he says, "Oh, what's the matter?" Eliezer won't tell him. He says, "Listen, I think I gave you a little too much to bite off over here. Let me give you something a little easier." He brings him to another land that's easier to do work on. And Eliezer's crying, and he says, "I don't get it. The easy land you cry, the hard land you cry, every land you cry. Why are you crying?" So finally, Eliezer confesses to him. He says, I have a desire to learn Torah. I have a deep desire, an awakening in my soul to study Torah. And you never sent me to a yeshiva, and I've never learned Torah, and I don't have the ability to. And the sources don't tell us why he had this awakening, but he said, I have an awakening. I want to study Torah, and I know that you don't approve, and you won't allow it. And that's why I'm crying, because I can't reconcile my ambition with the lifestyle that you've carved out for me. And his father starts laughing at him and mocking him. He says, "You, a man of 20-something years old, you're going to study Torah, you're going to go to yeshiva? It's too late for you. You'll never be a scholar at this point. You're dreaming silly dreams. Forget about it. Don't be an idiot. You wanna study Torah? This is what you do. Earn a living, get married, have children, send your children to yeshiva with the money that you've earned. You'll raise Torah scholars for children if you want, but you're washed up." So Eliezer is crying, and he doesn't accept his father's rebuke, and he begins to fast and beseech God for help with this issue. And it says after 2 weeks of fasting, Elijah the prophet appears to Eliezer, and he says, if you want to learn Torah, you have to go to Jerusalem and seek out Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the disciple of Hillel, who we spoke about before. So he travels to Jerusalem. He doesn't tell his father because he knows he won't meet his approval. He just kind of runs away from home. He disappears, and his family doesn't know where he went. And he goes to Jerusalem, and he seeks out Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he finds him, and he says to him, "Rabbi, I desire to learn Torah." And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "Okay, let me give you a little test to see what you know." And he tests him. He sees he knows nothing. He knows nothing. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai realized this is a hopeless case. This guy is not serious. He's not workable. So he kind of tries to brush him off by saying, "Okay, listen, I'll give you a little bit, lessons in halacha." So he starts teaching him very basic things, for a few minutes a day. And he says, "Okay, come back tomorrow." And Rabbi Eliezer is getting the feeling that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is not taking him seriously, and he's not teaching him in a serious way, and he's not learning the way he wants to learn. So once again, he begins fasting and beseeching God for help. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai catches on that Eliezer's fasting, because his breath was very bad, which happens if you don't eat for a long time. So he says, "Are you fasting?" And Eliezer says, "No." And he says, "Come to my house for lunch." And Eliezer says, I ate already. He says, "Where'd you eat?" He said, "I ate at my host's house." His host was Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, another student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He says, "Okay, goodbye." And then he calls Rabbi Yossi HaKohen. He says, "Eliezer staying with you?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "He ate at your house?" He goes, "No, he told me he was going to eat by you." He says, "Have you seen him eat lately?" He goes, "No, I haven't seen him eat in a couple of weeks." So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai realized what was going on. He brings Eliezer back. He says, "Listen, I see you're really serious, and I'm going to teach you a little bit more seriously now because I see you're dedicated." And he starts teaching him more. But every day when he brings Eliezer back for his next lesson, Eliezer has forgotten what he learned the day before. He just was a poor student. He had a poor memory, and things were going in one ear, out the other. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was really getting the feeling that Eliezer was hopeless. So he said, "Listen, I I can't really work with you. I'm sorry, but there's nothing really I can do for you. And when Eliezer hears this, he's so broken. He says, give me another chance. I'm going to make this work, please. And he begs him. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, okay, this is what I want you to know. Come back tomorrow, show me that you know it. And he teaches him something. And Eliezer goes and he reviews it and he reviews it and he reviews it until it's emblazoned in his memory. And he comes back the next day and he shows him, I know it. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai teaches him more. And he comes back the next day and he knows it. And Eliezer says, more, Rebbe. It's not enough. You're spoon feeding me like a child. He says, I need more. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai starts teaching him more and more and more. And Eliezer works harder and harder and harder. And he retains it all through a lot of hard work. He did not naturally have a good memory. So much so that in Pirkei Avos, the chapters of the fathers, called the Ethics of the Fathers, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is quoted as praising each one of his 5 disciples. And when he reaches Eliezer, his praise for Eliezer is he calls him Bor Sid She'eno Ma'abed Tipa, which means he is a cistern that is, how do you say sid? That's insulated, an insulated cistern. Sid in Hebrew is like is gypsum, it's plaster. So the idea was you could have a well dug in the ground, but it would have cracks. So water would fill it, but it would slowly leak out, right? But if you had a bor sid, if you had a well that was plastered on the inside, so then it would retain all the water and not allow any to leak out. So he's called a bor sid she'ena ma'abed tipa. He's like a plastered well that doesn't lose a single drop. Meaning his praise for Eliezer was every single drop of learning he retains without losing a drop. This is a praise for a guy who started off, he knew nothing and he could retain nothing. But through hard work, he was able to overcome that handicap until he was renowned for his memory. And it just goes to show where there's a will, there's a way. You want to accomplish something, you can accomplish it. Of course, all with God's help. But like I told someone today, when God says to Moses, what is that in your hand? And he says, it's a stick. My Rabbi Zachariah Wallerstein used to say, what kind of a conversation is this between the creator of the universe and the greatest prophet who ever lived? What's in your hand? What God doesn't know? Oh, it's a stick? What? You think God didn't know when he asked you? You think that's what he's asking? You're giving him such a simplistic answer? How could the two greatest minds between the infinite creator and the greatest prophet ever have such a childish conversation? So he said the question of what's in your hand is not physically what's in your hand. It's what's in your ability. What is within your ability, Moshe? What is your power? And Moshe said, a stick. He said, I'm like a stick. What's a stick? A stick is a lifeless piece of wood. It has no power whatsoever. It can do nothing. However, when it's held in the hand of a powerful wielder, the one who wields the stick can imbue that stick with tremendous power to accomplish great things. He says, that's what I am. I'm a nothing. Moses was the humblest man who ever lived. He said, I'm absolutely nothing, which means that in your hand, Hashem, you can shape me and you can wield me into anything you desire. And in that way, I have infinite capability when I am a tool in your hand. So I'm simultaneously nothing and everything depending on how I am being imbued with power by the Creator. So this Eliezer was a nothing who became everything, and every single person can be that, can make themselves that nothing, to say, God, I'm nothing but a tool in your hand. Please wield me to accomplish your will. And then there's no limit. There's no limit to what can be accomplished. And Eliezer is an example of that, but that's not where the story ends. Many years go by, and Eliezer becomes one of the foremost sages of the generation. No question about it, hands down. He's one of the most prominent voices in the Mishnah, and one of the teachers of Rabbi Akiva, who's arguably one of our greatest teachers, not arguably, without a doubt, one of the greatest teachers in our history. Eliezer is famous for many great accomplishments, which we won't go into right now, but that's the fact. He became from the greatest of the great. Now, what happened? And so we have this, the Medrash then goes with a little like, meanwhile, back at Hyrcanus's house, so you have Hyrcanus, his father, and the brothers come to him and say, Father, you're elderly. We don't know how much longer you have in the world. when you pass away, we're going to have to divide up your assets. We're the sons, we're the inheritors. And you have a no good son, Eliezer. He was a lazy bum. He wouldn't do any work. He ran away from home because he didn't want to work. When you die, he's going to show up and say, hey, where's my portion? He's going to want to take. He didn't earn like we earned. Father, you need to cut him out of the inheritance. Go to Jerusalem. Go to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the head of the Sanhedrin, and tell him you want to cut your son Eliezer out of the inheritance and make it legally binding. And Hyrcanus says, okay, you're right. So he travels to Jerusalem. It says when he gets there, he asks for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and they say, oh, he's in the middle of a celebration. We'll bring you there. Doesn't tell us what he was celebrating. But there was some type of a banquet, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is at the head of the table. William, I'm not sure if I'm still with you. I see my image freezing. Can you confirm whether or not you can see me or hear me?
Can you hear me now? Yes, I can see.
I hear you now, and I see that I'm moving again. Are we good? Did I lose you?
It froze. It did sound like it jittered a little bit, but you're back. You're back up running, so you're good.
Okay. I hope I didn't lose too much of the story here. So Hyrcanus goes to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to ask him to cut Eliezer out of the inheritance since he disappeared and didn't earn his way. And when he gets there, they bring him to this banquet where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is sitting at the head of the table, and many great rabbis are sitting around, and the prominent, wealthy, famous men. It's a party for many elite Jews that are gathered to honor Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, whatever the occasion might have been. And they come to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. They say, Hyrcanus is here. The famous, wealthy individual Hyrcanus is here. He's here. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, oh, Hyrcanus is here, is he? Well, he deserves a special seat. And Eliezer is sitting next to him, and he says, Eliezer, could you move over? There's a very special guest who arrived. I want to give him a seat next to me. So here you have your prize student Eliezer, and you're telling him take a second seat to some newcomer. Like, well, what's going on here? So Hyrcanus comes in, and he's brought to the seat right next to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now he's sitting between his own son and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he doesn't recognize his own son sitting next to him. It's been many years, and he's looks very sagacious and rabbinic, almost like Joseph. They didn't expect to see him looking like a king, so they didn't see him. The cognitive dissonance was too great to imagine this person in front of him could have any relationship to the brother they sold into slavery. So here too is his no good, lazy bum son, who would amount to nothing, is certainly not this rabbinic figure sitting next to me. And he says, Rabbi Yochanan, I have to discuss with you an urgent matter regarding my son and my inheritance. He says, I'll hear you soon, but first we need to hear words of Torah. I'm going to ask one of my students to speak. And he says, Eliezer, would you please speak? And Rabbi Eliezer gets up and he starts speaking words of Torah. And the words of the Medrash are very poetic there. It says that the words flowed from him. I don't remember exactly the wording, but it was like more beautiful than the words that came from Moses at Sinai, and the light that was glowing from his face was brighter than the sun. It's obviously hyperbole, and he just dazzled all the people gathered with his beautiful words of Torah and the lesson that he gave over at that time. And Hyrcanus was blown away. He still did not recognize that it was Sonny, but he was so impressed with this scholar. He was so moved. He said, this individual is incredible. And he leans over to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and he says, who is this man? And he says, his name is Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Have you ever heard of him? And Hyrcanus says, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus? My son Eliezer? That's my son Eliezer? And he says, that's your son. And it says, as Eliezer is standing there at the podium, his father walks up over to him, comes behind him, and he embraces him from behind, and he gives him a kiss on the head, and he says, "My son Eliezer, I missed you. I didn't know what became of you. I'm so proud of you. I can't tell you how proud I am of you. I was wrong about you." And he said, "I have to tell you the truth. I came here to cut you out of my inheritance, but I see that what you have aimed to do was the truth. You were right all along, and I was wrong. And rather than cut you out of the inheritance, I'm going to have Rabbi Yochanan sign my entire inheritance over to you. And my brothers will come to you for their portion. Your brothers will come to you for their portion. Such is that's sort of the end of the story of the rise of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. But it's the reason I bring it up again, to understand that he was such a great Torah sage, though he inherited a tremendous amount of wealth, and that didn't hamper him. But at the same time, when I'm this teaching from the Medrash about woe to us from the day of judgment, woe to us from the day of rebuke, it's a harsh pill to swallow, and it's difficult because it leaves us feeling very insecure. And I want to impress upon you at the same time that this very same Eliezer who we're talking about overcame insurmountable odds to become who he became. And no matter where you are and who you are and where you come from and what you've done and what you're doing, if you want to change, you can change. If you want to grow, you can grow. If you want to succeed, you can succeed. If you make yourself a stick in the hand of God, you can accomplish anything. And then you need not fear from that day of judgment where they're going to ask you, why didn't you this and why didn't you that? Because you will have overcome those things. And you say, but I still did them. Still going to ask me. But our rabbis tell us that a person's wrongdoings can be transformed through teshuvah, through sincere repentance, can be transformed into merit, such that the sins a person committed can be counted for him as merits rather than demerits. In other words, one level is you don't repent, so it counts against you, and it's spiritually damaging to you. On the next level is you repent, and you can have them kind of erased from the account, and they don't count. And the higher level is they can count in a positive way. Oh, you did those things? Here's, so to speak, your mitzvah cash payoff for it. That's a silly analogy. But whatever there's a spiritual benefit. How can you get a spiritual benefit from a sin? Now, you can't say, oh, in that case, let me go sin, and then I'll repent, and I'll get a credit for it. A rabbi say, those who say, I'll sin and repent, are not offered the opportunity of repentance. So you can't do that. But if it happens, and it does happen, we're human beings, that we do sin probably many times a day, and I'm talking about myself, then the perspective is, if we can introspect and get in touch with that and feel like I am self-conscious of my shortcomings, and based on that awareness, I have a desire to outgrow them and grow beyond them, those setbacks can be a catapult for a person's growth. And you could look back and say, I see that you did this wrong thing. However, you utilize that after the fact as a catalyst for growth that helped you ultimately reach a height. And therefore, we can never regret our past. I mean, we can regret in the sense of when we did something wrong, being sorry for it and not repeating it. But in other words, to get so caught up in it and so depressed over things we can no longer change or affect. Rather, let me see if I can pay it forward. Let me see if I can make amends through improving myself. And then we can look back and say, everything I did until this point was setting me up for greatness. And many times our sages talk about something called the Yerida Litzorech Aliyah. Yerida Litzorech Aliyah means going down for the sake of going up. And the analogy that's given is, a person wants to jump. So how does he jump higher? He has to crouch. If you try jumping without crouching, you'll jump a little. But if you want to jump high, you have to crouch. Now, again, I'm not recommending that people purposely sin. But in other words, sometimes when you hit bottom, that's the catalyst for a catapult of growth that wouldn't have been there if you had just been middle. They say sometimes the enemy, what do they say? The enemy of great is good, something like that. I'm paraphrasing, right? The enemy of great is good. Not bad. The enemy of great is good. You know why? Because it's good, it's fine. Ain't broke, don't fix it. So you don't grow past there because I'm satisfied with mediocrity. right? And that has its place. But if you're failing, then you know I got to get out of here. And you can learn from your failures in such a way that makes you better. And there are many individuals who we think of today as huge success stories that started off as huge failures. And I think statistically, if we look into it, we would see that the most successful people were the biggest failures. Though people who are somewhat successful did not have as many failures and setbacks as the people who are ultimately extremely successful. The failures were set up for success. So I wrote down a few examples in my notes. I remember this story that moves me to this day. When I became a teacher at a school in Seattle, the first day of teacher in service, where the principal was talking to the teachers, about preparing for the year. So the principal told this story. She said there was a woman who invented a brand of pantyhose called Spanx. Okay. And I don't know about pantyhose because I'm a man, but apparently these were wildly popular, maybe still are, and the woman became a billionaire, something like that. And they interviewed her and they said, how did you come up with the idea for these pantyhose that are so beloved and comfortable and successful? How'd you do it? Right? So she said, when I was listen to this. This is so important. This is so powerful. When I was growing up, we would sit around the table, our family, with our parents, and my father would ask at the table, I want to hear something that you tried and failed. And we said, what did you try and fail today? What did you try and fail today? What did you try and fail today? And each child, he would ask, I want to hear what you tried and failed. And this kid would say, I tried doing this and it didn't work out. And the father would say, I am so proud of you. I'm so happy you did that. I'm so proud of you. You made me very proud. And then the next person would say, I tried this and it didn't work out. I'm so proud of you. That's beautiful that you did that. And each person, and she said she taught them never to be afraid to try and never be afraid to fail. Because if you're afraid to fail, you'll never accomplish. And she said, I can't tell you how many different business ventures I tried and failed before I came up with this successful one. But if my father hadn't prepared me to keep trying and keep failing and feel good about it, that I tried, even though I failed, I would never have been able to reach where I reached to come up with this product that made me so successful. And our principal gave this over to the teachers. She said, don't be afraid to fail. Try whatever you want to try in the classroom, even if it fails. Says, I'll support you, because that's how we're going to have successful teachers. That's how we're going to have successful classrooms. That's how we're going to have successful students, with teachers who are not afraid to fail and who teach their students not to be afraid to fail. And that has to be what our school is about. So, for example, Jim Carrey, is some famous people I looked up. Jim Carrey, who growing up in the 80s and 90s, I watched a lot of his comedy and was very entertained, and he became, the highest paid actor in Hollywood, at the time. I don't know what they do now, but making $20 million a movie, right? But he was not an immediate success. They asked him about, how did you reach success? He said when he started stand-up, he was booed off the stage. His first stand-up comic gig, he was booed off the stage. Imagine if he said, I'm a failure. I can't be a comedian. What if he had said that? He would never have succeeded. He auditioned for Saturday Night Live, which is a very famous comedy show, and he was rejected. He was rejected from Saturday Night Live and said, you're not good enough. You're not funny enough. And he didn't give up. And he became one of the most famous comedians in the world and the highest paid. Now, I'm not lauding Hollywood culture or Jim Carrey as a person, because I don't know anything about him, but it's a model for success is not being afraid to fail and using failure as a springboard for success. And people know about J.K. Rowling. the author of Harry Potter. This was a woman who was in a very difficult place in life. She had lost her job. She had no money. Her marriage failed. She was a single mom with nothing to her name. She wrote this story, Harry Potter. She brought it to 12 different publishing houses that all rejected the story. Imagine going to 12 major publishers and being told, garbage, we don't want your story. 12. And she didn't give up. She finally found a small publisher that agreed to print 1,000 copies of a book, which is not a lot, and 500 of them they donated to libraries. But from those 500 copies that made it into people's hands, and however many people borrowed her books from libraries, Harry Potter became a phenomenon. She sold, based on what I read from the time it was written, over 400 million books. But she turned failure into success. The last example I'm going to give here, Thomas Edison, who's the inventor of many things, including the light bulb, they say that he failed. He tried over 10,000 times to create a commercially viable light bulb, electric light bulb. Over 10,000 tries until he finally invented the light bulb that worked practically well enough to be sold commercially. And a newspaper reporter asked him if he felt like a failure and if he felt like giving up after 9,000 attempts. He said, didn't you feel like giving up after 9,000 attempts and failures? This is what he answered. This is very moving. Why would I feel, there's a quote, why would I feel like a failure? And why would I ever give up? I now know definitely over 9,000 ways an electric light bulb will not work. Success is almost in my grasp. Yeah, 9,000 tries and 9,000 failures. You know how successful I am? I've learned 9,000 ways this won't work. I'm almost there. How many more times could I try and fail? Can't be too many more. I'm almost there. Every failure is just one step closer to success. So we have a verse in Proverbs, and I think I wrote it down in my notes, but I don't see it right now, the citation. There's a verse in Proverbs that says, Sheva yipol tzadik v'kam. The righteous falls 7 times and he rises. The righteous falls 7 times and he rises. Listen to those words. It doesn't need commentary. The righteous falls 7 times. Now, 7 is a euphemism for many. The righteous falls many times. What do you mean? He's righteous. He's righteous. Doesn't it mean that he doesn't fail, that he's perfect, that he's only good all the time? No. The righteous falls 7 times and rises. And there's a lot of depth there, because it's the key to his success is not that he doesn't fall. He falls. And you know what? He falls many times, but he rises. If you keep rising, you'll succeed. But some even understand the verse to mean, you know how he got righteous? Because first he fell and he fell and he fell, and then he rose. Meaning he rose not despite his failure. He rose on account of his failure. He rose because of his failure. And so I say to you, my brothers and sisters out there, we're all failures. We're all failures. Our life is full of failure. Who's perfect? Who doesn't fail many times a day? Not me. I certainly do. But we need to have the approach of the father of the woman who invented Spanx. You have to look at your Father in heaven who's looking down at you and saying, I'm so proud of you because you tried and you weren't afraid to try, because you didn't give up and say, I'm not going to succeed, so why try? Right? We need to embrace our inner failure and say, my failure will be my road to success. So again, no one's trying to fail on purpose, but we need to try with the mindset of no fear of failure. And when the failure comes, not to let us get us down, but to look at like Thomas Edison and say, I'm the one step closer to success. This is a reason for celebration. And if we can do that, we could look at all of our misdeeds as opportunities and takeoff points towards a success. And I say that in the context of, again, woe to us from the day of judgment, woe to us from the day of rebuke, when all of our excuses are going to be laid to rest, and we're going to have to reckon with our shortcomings. But what it means is, if we can internalize that lesson now and stop making the excuses, and charge ahead full force to accomplish what we want to accomplish, whether it's in the spiritual world or the physical world, and understand that if we embrace those failures as our takeoff point to success, the failures become success. The like our sages tell us, the sins become merits. That's how sins become merits. So if we don't want to fear the day of rebuke, and we don't want to fear the day of judgment, then we need to look at ourselves long and hard today and honestly and say, what excuses am I making? Let me cut it out. Let me not be afraid to try, and let me use all of my failures only as motivation, only as proof that I'm one step closer to succeeding. And with that, we can truly grow. We can follow in the footsteps of the righteous. We can fall many times and then rise. And it's my sincere blessing to everyone listening and watching that Hashem bless our efforts and help us to embrace our failures and get up from all of those fallings and to truly rise. And here we'll pause, I suppose.
Word to the wise. That was awesome. Very good. Very good. I heard that Thomas Edison had a similar story about inventing the light bulb. So he failed like 900 times. He said, I didn't fail 900 times. There was 901 steps in creating the light bulb.
Right. So I think that's more or less the quote that I said from Thomas Edison.
Oh, got you.
9,000 failures is
yeah.
9,000 steps closer to success. I'm almost there.
That's brilliant. Okay, Rabbi, thank you so much for your time, and thank you all for tuning in. Appreciate all the viewers in the comments out there. Be sure to like the video if you haven't already, and share the video with your friends. This is a really good resource. I'm hoping you guys are all enjoying it. So y'all have a great week, and Rabbi, until next week, shalom, everybody, and we'll see you on the other side. Peace.